Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I'm going to be officially inducting gold foil cards into the Binder of Fame. And gold foil is one of the most 90s, one of the most indicative elements of 90s cards that you're going to find, because gold foil really was more of a 90s phenomenon than anything else. They were not present on sports cards prior to 1989, and 89 is the proto-90s year, so it is the workup year. And so both with action-packed with gold foil, and then the upper deck holograms are silver foil adjacent. It's pretty close. They appeared on cards, but not as an accent. It was just as a special feature on the card that was not really intended to be viewed per se. But that was the first year that we were getting foil on regular sports cards. So it was the beginning of gold foil as we would know it. But by the time that we got to the end of the decade, things had pretty much gotten kind of chaotic. And the new decade, or the new millennium, had to kind of get away from many of the qualities of the 90s because there was too much chaos going on. And they needed to kind of stabilize things in order to allow the new elements in sports cards that people wanted to follow, allow that to get focused on. And so most of what we got for gold foil on cards really was in the 90s. It certainly was the era when cards were defined very heavily by gold foil. And it was a slightly slow start because in 1989, like I said, you basically had action-packed, and that was just regional. 1990, you had action-packed. It wasn't until 1991 where there was a pretty big explosion of use of gold foil, because you still had action-packed, but you also had Pacific, you had Wild Card, you had Topps, and you even had Don Russ was using it. So there was more engagement of the opportunities of gold foil or copper foil or silver foil, whatever foil they wanted to use. And so by 1991, it was already growing at a pretty rapid pace. And by 1994, it was an industry standard. In fact, it was kind of the quintessential 94 element on sports cards. By the time you got into the mid to late decade, it was really the height of gold foil. But at the end of the decade, it was already too chaotic and starting to fall away. And by 2000, you had, well, for instance, Fleer completely abandoned foil on their cards and went with a very classic type of look of cards, or look for their cards. And that was very much a trend that we were seeing, not just with them, but Topps was also reshifting the way that they were approaching the cards to feel different, and we saw Playoff looking different. Not that they were necessarily abandoning gold foil as much as the whole concept of how you create a card in order to communicate to audiences. It was a different language, and gold foil just wasn't that prominent, because what gold foil does best is it gives a little accent of specialness, of class. It adds those things to the cards, so the cards are it doesn't take much. Topps is the perfect example. In 1991, they used no gold foil. I mean, okay, you could say that the Desert Storm cards did have gold foil, and that was true, but that was a special release. In 92 and 93, they didn't use gold foil except for a parallel. But in 1994, now they made a change. The 1994 cards were done where there was a fair amount of gold foil on the cards as a normal part of the presentation of the cards. It had been used as the accent for the parallel prior to that, but by 1994, now they were starting to say, no, we're going to have gold foil on the card in order to make the cards feel fancier, and they could continue to be the, yes, I'm going to say it, gold standard of rookie cards. That was really what they wanted. And gold foil gave that accent, so that by the time you got to 1997, 1998, they really only needed to have just the Topps logo in foil, and that was enough because it allowed the card to feel like a fancy, significant card, even though it was also basic. That was something that was necessary for the decade. You look at 1994 and you look at like Pro Line, and Pro Line looks weird because it didn't have gold foil on it. How many other cards didn't have gold foil on them in 1994? Not a lot. So for the hobby, now all of a sudden you get so used to just having some gold foil on a card. When a card was released that didn't have gold foil, it better have something else in order to make up the difference, because we were so, it was something that we didn't realize that we needed to identify on a card. It just helped it to make it feel like a proper, real, serious card. Now, Fleer had an interesting journey with gold foil because Fleer proper didn't really use it much at all. And you can see in the 1997 card where they have basically a rough cardboard feel to the card, where it's almost like sandblasted. It has the texture of sandblasting with a touch of gold foil. Gives a really nice punch to the card and makes it just stand out a little bit more in a way that allowed the vintage characteristic of the construction with a modernity that were combined together with this card, where you just had the gold foil giving that accent. 98, 99, they were still using the gold foil in different ways, but prior to that, they didn't bother with it with Fleer. But Ultra, it was part of what saved Ultra, because in 1991, Ultra was way behind the curve. In fact, it was modeling itself after Pro Set from 1990, and interestingly, Pro Set in 1991 was more impressive than Ultra was, even though Ultra was supposed to be a premium brand. So in 1992, they got rid of most of the border, they gave a high gloss, and they added gold foil. And like that, they instantly became the standard bearer for the hobby. They surpassed Upper Deck, and it didn't take much, but having that gold foil on it, that accent of gold foil, really made a serious impact on how you perceive the card, and it made it stand out. It definitely cleared Pinnacle. It definitely even cleared Upper Deck. I mean, it stood out as the fancy card of the year. That's all that it needed, and they always had gold foil, or I believe it was always gold foil or hollow foil. They always had it on every Ultra set ever after. They needed to have it on it, and it became a part of the definition of what an Ultra card was. They didn't need much. In 1995, it was literally all that they had for the design, but that was the same with Pinnacle, that was the same with Upper Deck. It was, and then of course in 1994, so many brands had already been that way as well. But for Ultra, they realized that little element was necessary for the card to feel right, and then that was what Topps picked up as well, and Topps likewise rarely put any other foil on the card. It was just the Topps logo. Just that little bit was all that they needed to make the card feel serious, significant, well thought out, well crafted, well appreciated. But there was nobody who was more into gold foil than Pacific. I mean, it was their big thing. It took them a while to get there, and yet at the same time, it didn't take them any time at all, because in 1991 when they launched, they used it for their Picks the Pros cards. And they did that in 91, 92, and 93. And then in 1994, they didn't do Picks the Pros, but they didn't need to worry because the main set cards had gold foil. And from that point on, it was always used on their main set cards. Gold foil was, I mean, for better or for worse, it was kind of a chaotic mess, but they really sold themselves on gold foil or foil on cards in some capacity. The parallels, the regular cards, didn't matter. And they did learn an important lesson from their Picks the Pros cards, because in 1990, when Action Pact launched their set with all that gold foil, they learned the lesson of too much gold foil is too much. Well, they sort of learned it. So in 1991, Action Pact used gold foil as an accent. Now they would use a solid gold sheet of, it wasn't gold foil, but for their mint cards, they would use 24 karat gold leaf on the cards. They would do quarterback inserts with silver over their entire surface, but for the most part, Action Pact figured out after 1990, you got to scale back the gold foil and allow it to be an accent, and that works best. It took Pacific quite a few years, but by 1995, they had finally figured it out, and they always used gold foil as an accent, except for with their Prism cards, because with the Prism cards, it was all about this prismatic background, and that was fine, right? Well, no, even that was too much. And so in 1996, we got to see something that was really amazing with Pacific, where they decided to try and make a card where the entire card surface was gold foil except for the player. And that was their replacement of Prism, called Dynagon Prism, or I think it was Dynagon Prism. It was a gold foil surface card that for some reason had Prism in the name because it was the continuation of that legacy. But this was a card that used subtle texturing on the card that worked so beautifully in crafting a very interesting card. Not the greatest card of all time because it's a lot of gold foil. And in 1997, they would make a hybrid card where it was mostly gold foil, but they also had other elements on the card to help to diffuse it. And then over in Invincible, they were doing something very similar, only without the texturing. Pacific was able to really work with this and figure out how to craft an overpowering card that still had the delicacy that you needed to make gold foil work. You look over at Ultra, where they would come and do that in a couple of years, but they didn't have the picture of the player. The whole surface was gold foil. That was overdone. That was almost impossible to really see and really appreciate. That's part of the problem that gold foil has. It can overpower a card in a hurry. You look at the 1994-95 Ultra all-rookie team basketball cards, and there's way too much foil on the side that it doesn't work in balance with anything else. Foil is hard to work with when you start using a lot of it, and Pacific was able to explore it and find some really great ways to work with an overpowering amount of gold foil. But for most companies, they couldn't quite figure out how to really master gold foil because you have to use it as little accents. You can't use it as a dominant feature. When it was tried, it usually would fall pretty well short. Dufex was an area where you could get away with it, but past that, it was really difficult. And so card companies almost entirely used gold foil as just a little feature. Upper deck for their logos, tops for their logos, those kinds of things, and also for text. But past that, card companies tried to stay away from getting too heavily into gold foil, silver foil, red foil, any different kind of foil, because they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose themselves in making a card that didn't look good. And so by the end of the decade, the whole concept of making a card, there was more of a retro quality where they wanted to step back and have something that is typical with generations. When you have a generation, that generation sees things that are coming up as new and ideal, and what was just before is old and archaic and frankly ugly. But what's before that is exotic. And so for 80s card styles, in the 90s, for the most part, we didn't want to care about that. But by the time you got to the 2000s, now you had a hobby that was looking at the 90s and not really all that interested in it, but they were looking back at the 80s and getting more intrigued by that. And so you see more of the classic vintage concept of cards showing up in the new millennium. And so gold foil didn't bring the asset that it had brought in the past to the card industry. So the card industry fell away from it, which is too bad. But for 90s cards, gold foil was a critical aspect of how cards were seen, but also with how cards grew over time and evolved with the 90s and got us into the new millennium. I'm not sure what else I want to say about the card. I could go on and on and on talking about all sorts of different aspects of gold foil, but I would like to bring this to a close here because I think it gives a pretty good feeling of the dichotomy of gold foil, the importance that it had, and the window of time where it was really at its height. If I get past this, then I'm starting to get into nitpicking about all the little subtle details of what came before, what came during, what came after, how it worked in, etc., which is just a whole discussion that we don't even need to get into. But there are very few technologies that have impacted sports cards as clearly as gold foil has. And it's unfortunate that it wasn't used as much in the new millennium. But like I said, it was a different card market, a different audience, a different interpretation of cards. So at least we had this for the time that we did. So that's where I'm going to go with gold foil here as I'm inducting it into the Binder of Fame. Now, I have also done a separate video where I did it as a story of cardboard. If you haven't seen that, definitely go check that out. And check out the other stories of cardboard that I've talked about here in this month. And then, do subscribe if you haven't done so you can follow along. And let me know what you think should be discussed in terms of stories of cardboard and in terms of what should be inducted into the Binder of Fame. I haven't been getting hardly any feedback on the channel, so I am curious to hear what people have to say about it. So definitely do that. But other than that, thank you very much for watching.